We have 2 or 3 generations of people in our societies now who have not been taught the things that we've just discussed. Instead, they've been taught to hate their own societies. They've been taught to hate the values of their own civilization. It is no surprise, therefore, that we're heading in the direction that we're heading. This is what Orwell talked about when he said that he who controls the past controls the future. Well, thank you very much. First of all, can you please join me in thanking Scott, the CIS and IPA, for organizing this event. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, before I say anything else, it's such a pleasure to be in Australia. It's my first time here. I didn't really know what to expect. I was actually on the flight over. This Australian guy recognized me. He came over. We started chatting. He found out I was doing a few talks. And he said, "Oh, mate, watch out. We've got a big problem with political correctness in Australia." I didn't know what to think. So I get to my hotel, I check in, lady gives me the card, says, "This is your card for your room. And if you want to have breakfast tomorrow, go to the 2 Fat Indians." And I was like, this is my kind of place. Wouldn't happen in the UK. We don't use the word fat anymore. We say people of girth. Now, thank you all for coming out. As Scott said, it's so lovely to see so many young people here, many of you under 50. So thank you for coming, all 6 of you. It's a pleasure to see you. And I'm not going to speak for very long. I'm really keen to get to your questions in the Q&A that we're going to do with Glenn in a minute. But the thing I wanted to talk to you about tonight, just to set the tone of our discussion really, is something that I'm constantly talking about now, and Scott mentioned the title of my book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, is the West. What is the West? How do we define it? How do we think about it? And the reason I think about it is, as he mentioned, I was born in the Soviet Union and grew up in that country, in that society, and then in early 90s, mid-90s, I moved to England. And by the way, those of you who've seen my ARC speech, you'll remember I mentioned Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And somebody later claimed online that I was comparing myself to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This is ridiculous, of course. There's no comparison. Alexander Solzhenitsyn spent most of his life in a prison camp where he endured terrible conditions, punishments, and brutal beatings and a starvation diet. I went to an English boarding school. That's where the similarities end. But what is the West? You know, I think it's very important to think about this, and particularly here in Australia, because you're a Western country in the middle of Asia, and it strikes me that if you were to conduct an experiment to prove that Western civilization is special in some way, you would do what the British did here. You'd find a barren continent on the other side of the world full of venomous creatures. You'd collect a few thousand of your least law-abiding citizens, let's put it diplomatically, right? You'd ship them over. You'd leave them there for a couple of centuries. You'd let them crack on with it, and then you'd come back and have a look, right? And what would you see? What would you see? Well, you'd see a society that, broadly speaking, is thriving. What do I mean by thriving? Well, the different ways to look at it. We could talk about GDP per capita or some kind of boring poll numbers. When I think about it, I think about the fact that how many Australians are taking their children, climbing into rickety boats, and braving shark-infested waters in search of a better life? And yet thousands of people are doing the exact opposite to come here. That's what I mean by thriving. Now, it seems to me that that Western experiment requires some kind of explanation. We know that it's not random. Millions of people are streaming through the southern border of the United States, dealing with Mexican cartels and putting themselves and their children in danger to go to the United States. Tens of thousands of people are getting onto boats and crossing the English Channel, which again is a perilous journey, and so on. Why is this happening? It seems to me that this requires some kind of explanation. This is not an accident. This is not an accident at all, but we seem to not really understand that anymore. And I think about it like this. If I was to wake you up in the middle of the night and put a gun to your head and ask you, why is this happening? Why is the West attracting people to come here? And we've got to a point in our culture where quite a lot of people would rather die in that situation than admit the truth, which is our societies are better. I don't mean superior. I just mean they're better at producing the things that human beings seem to want, right? Now, what are they? What are the things? Well, if you watch too many Hollywood movies, you say freedom and democracy. Okay, well, why are they good? Why is freedom good? Why is democracy good? That's the silence I'm talking about. It's the silence in all of our heads because we no longer are able to articulate the reason that our civilization is as successful as it is. And I think this is a big problem, a big, big problem. The West has become, I talked about this in my book, it's a little bit like a cargo cult. Most of you probably in this neck of the woods know what one is, but I'll explain anyway. During World War II, the Americans and the Japanese used many small islands in the Pacific to station troops, to have munitions dumps, to station their supplies, etc. And what happened was the local tribes that lived there were fairly primitive technologically. They benefited massively from the fact that they were able to get access to Western medicine, Western food, Western supplies, clothing, etc. And their quality of life improved dramatically. And then the war ended, and the Americans and the Japanese packed up and went home. And the Western food and the Western supplies and the Western clothes ended or started running out. So what did the native tribes that lived on these islands do? Well, they saw what the Americans had been doing and the Japanese, so they started imitating. They made headphones out of coconuts. They made radio towers out of bamboo. They created fake landing strips and marched up and down with fake rifles made out of bamboo. And this is increasingly what we do in the West with our own values. We say these words, freedom, democracy, but we have no idea what they mean anymore. We can't explain to our children why they should value those things because we don't think about them because we've been trained not to. So what do I mean exactly? Let me try and articulate it in a simple way. People don't come to our countries and risk their lives for freedom and democracy. Very, very few people do. The reason people come is our societies are very, very good at creating the things that all human beings want. Safety, prosperity, and the ability to choose your gender. Now, why are our societies so good at creating safety and prosperity? I asked Jordan Peterson this once at dinner. I said to him, what is Western civilization? And Jordan did what Jordan always does. He launched into a 20-minute monologue where you have no idea what he's talking about for the first 18 minutes, right? And then at about the 19-minute mark, it all makes sense. And this is what he said. He said there are chimp troops, and in a chimp troop, there are two primary strategies for how an alpha male can control that troop. The first is you're the biggest and the most powerful and the strongest, and you will dominate through force and power and brutality anyone who challenges your authority. And this is an effective strategy, but only in the short term. Only as long as you are the strongest, only as long as you are the most powerful. The moment you take your eye off the ball, you get injured, you're a little bit weaker, you're a little bit older, you meet with a very brutal end because another chimp or another couple of chimps will come in and they will tear your head off, right? There's another strategy, and it's the reason that actually most alpha male chimps are often the smallest in the troop. And the reason is that they are able to build coalitions by grooming the other members in a good way. And exchanging things. They build coalitions. And the first principle of Western civilization that has made us as successful as we are, what we call democracy, what we really mean is government by consent. The idea that the individual matters enough that when he's governed by others, it is by consent. And this is very different, as you're probably well aware, to many other societies around the world. Now, this doesn't just apply to government. I'm not just talking about politics. This matters at every level of our societies. Our armies fight better because the soldier on the ground is able to feed information up the chain of command. In almost every aspect of our society, that freedom of the individual and the fact that the individual matters creates better results and better outcomes. Think about this. I mean, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine because no one can tell him the truth anymore. He was told that Ukraine would fold in 3 days, the Ukrainians would welcome them with bread and salt. That's not what happened. And while the war is not necessarily going that well for Ukraine, probably not going that well for either side, Vladimir Putin did not expect it to go like this, and the casualties and losses he's taken are completely unexpected. Why is that? Because in our system, our leaders are kept firmly on the ground. Their egos are kept in check. And we do not create these power vacuums where one person controls everything. And we're not able to speak truth to power at all. This idea of consensual leadership matters in everything. It's the reason there's never been a Chernobyl-level nuclear disaster in the West. Because the kinds of human errors that were made in that disaster could never, not never, but they're much, much less likely in our societies because of the fact that the voice of the individual matters. Which is where we come to the second pillar of our civilization, which is freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and freedom of research. Now, it's so funny that people call me right-wing because I said freedom of speech matters. I kind of thought that was a universal position in the West, but I've discovered that that is now how it's coded. And the reason I think freedom of speech matters is that you cannot think without speaking. You have to speak to think. And when you speak, you will very often find out that what you think is utter crap. Because other people will tell you. Right? This is Twitter in a nutshell, right? And it's this sharpening of idea against idea that is the reason that the Western societies have produced scientists and researchers and thinkers who've been able to ask and answer questions that you could not even raise in other societies. This is the bedrock of our success. The technological superiority that our societies have enjoyed through the ages are impossible to explain in any other way. Think about this, and please understand, I'm saying this in a morally neutral manner. It's just an example of that gap. Hernan Cortez arrived in Central America with a few hundred conquistadors. And because of his technological advantage, he was able to conquer an empire of 5 to 6 million Aztecs in a matter of years. That is the kind of superiority that we enjoy because of the way that we think freely, comparatively freely, because we are comparatively free from the dogma of religious control, authoritarian control, government control, and social restriction too, and cultural restriction. So these things have a very real and practical consequences. Did you see, by the way, how many of you have seen the Oppenheimer movie? Quite a lot of you. If you haven't seen it, it's a movie about the Manhattan Project, the way that the nuclear bomb was made. And if you weren't paying too much attention, you wouldn't have noticed that it being a Hollywood movie, they sort of talk about, Red's under the bed, Red Scare, McCarthyism getting out of hand, and everybody was getting hounded for being communist. And right at the end, they just slip in the fact that actually it was communists in America that gave Stalin the nuclear bomb, right? And why is that interesting to me? Well, the first Russian nuclear bomb was called RDS-1, and RDS stands for Россия делает сама. Russia does it by itself. Which is ironic, given that it was almost entirely stolen from the Americans. Right. The second greatest superpower in the world at that time could not produce it by itself. It had to steal it. That is the level of technological and scientific superiority that we in the West enjoy. Now, please understand, I'm not even remotely suggesting that the West has some kind of monopoly on genius and innovation and creativity. It's not the case, of course. People have great ideas everywhere. The Chinese invented gunpowder. But every single development in the history of firearms since, pretty much, from the musket to the cruise missile, has been made here in the West. Now, why is that? The reason is that we have an incentive structure in the West that encourages people to pursue innovation in a way that is completely impossible anywhere else. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, again, it's a word that we no longer understand the meaning of, capitalism. But what capitalism really means is private property and the rule of law. And it's amazing to me the extent to which people do not understand in the West how rare these things are. There is no private property in Russia. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia. And then he gave some money to an opposition party, and he was no longer the richest man in Russia. He spent 10 years in a penal camp instead, in a prison system, right? Because he gave money to the opposition party. I don't know who the richest man in Australia is, but I don't imagine if he gave money to the opposition party, that would be the case with him. It's the same in China. Or someone thinks maybe it will happen. I don't know. Things are getting out of hand here. The same thing is true in China. Jack Ma makes some comments, sixth richest man in China, makes some comments about banking regulation of all controversial things and disappears the next day and all sorts of trouble. Bao Fan, this is a billionaire in China again. No one quite knows what he did, but he disappeared for a year, turned up a few weeks ago after a year of being completely unheard of, and miraculously resigned from all his positions. Private property and the rule of law are rare and unique. Now, why does this matter? Well, if you don't get to keep the things that you create, then the incentive is not to innovate, the incentive is to comply. The reason we innovate in the West as much as we do is we get to keep the benefits of our creations. And it's an incentive structure that means that we are of service to our fellow citizens. In the Soviet Union where I grew up, or in Russia today, the way you get ahead is not by providing or creating things that are of value to other people. It's by doing things that, and it's not just, by the way, communist societies or Russia today, it's corrupt regimes everywhere. The way you get ahead is not by looking after the needs of your fellow citizens, creating things that they want to buy or they want to consume. You get ahead by pandering to the corrupt regime that's in charge, or to the clique of people that service the corrupt regime that is in charge. Capitalism is a way of aligning our incentives to create things that are of real value to our fellow citizens. And that is why we have the innovation that we have. This system drives our prosperity, and prosperity drives our strength and the stability that we've had. Now, government by consent, freedom of expression and freedom more generally, and capitalism. I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that all three of these pillars of our civilization are under threat today, not only from the outside, but also from the inside. We'll talk more with Glenn about it in the Q&A, but we've got a real problem with democracy for reasons that we can get into later. Our young people are not being brought up to understand why capitalism is the system that has produced the amazing things that we have. And freedom of expression, I think we all know, is being eroded. And why is this happening? Well, my view is, and I think this is well documented at this point, that we have 2 or 3 generations of people in our societies now who have not been taught the things that we've just discussed. Instead, they've been taught to hate their own societies. They've been taught to hate the values of their own civilization. It is no surprise, therefore, that we're heading in the direction that we're heading. This is what Orwell talked about when he said that he who controls the past controls the future. If we do not understand our past and where we come from, we will not get to a bright future that we want. And when you dare to bring this up, you know, people keep saying, oh, you're so brave. I'm not brave. I'm just saying some very, very obvious things that everybody knows. That's it, right? But when you bring this up, I think what people mean is people say, oh, these are culture war talking points, as if a society's culture doesn't matter. We are where we are because our culture is special. We are where we are because our culture is unique. And so the real message that I have for you tonight, and I hope that we get to talk more about this, is our culture is very, very important. And if people are going to call me a culture warrior, well, that's fine, because I think it's worth fighting for. Thank you very much.